You did nothing.
Hello, class. So we talked about some spooky subjects last week. So we talked about cannibalism and witchcraft. So in particular, or I don't know why I say in particular a lot, but we are going to be going over these subjects, not because they're necessarily relevant for AP content, although I will say that the Protestant Reformation and the counter or Catholic counter Reformation that we're going to be talking about in this YouTube video are really important for AP content. So if you master the skill that I'm going to teach, then definitely make sure you go back and look at this section of those sections of the YouTube video. Um, but we're going more over these two because they provide interesting ways, and I think they're more interesting subjects to a lot of you to master the skill of source analysis, or I'm sorry, sourcing a document. And so in front of you, you see SOAP analysis. So we've gone over this before. We use SOAP. It's an analytic tool to analyze documents that were given. You're going to have documents given to you on the multiple choice section. You're going to have documents given to you on the document based question. So I don't necessarily want you to use SOAP on the multiple choice questions. I think you can use it in your brain and that should be sufficient. But I don't necessarily want you to write the acronym SOAP and then try to come up with information before you answer the question because you don't have a lot of time on the multiple choice section. But it can be a very useful tool on the DBQ. And so this is obviously the anchor chart that is in the front of my room. This is an exact copy of what the acronym stands for. So make sure you look at that if you do not have it memorized already. So this is just a rundown of writing point of view statements, summary plus SOAP. So just go back and look at this. This is something that we've gone over before. How to fully address a document. Pause the video if you need this extra support. And then this is a rundown of something that I modeled in class. So Suleiman the Significant, known as the lawgiver by his own people, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire circa 1530. So we went over this example in class. And so I'm going to leave you with my SOAP analysis of it and then how I actually arrived at a point of view statement. And so make sure you feel free to pause the video if you need to. So now we're going to talk about witches. So here are the definitions of witch that we went over in class. This comes from the Houghton book that from Yale University Press that I think was incredibly interesting, but it was much too academic. So I did not assign any sections of the book, but I am giving away another section of the book. It was incredibly fun for me to read, just so I can feel like I have enough background information and massage my own anxieties. If I don't feel like I'm very good at a subject, I'm not as willing to, I'm not as willing to teach it. And I feel like or what I'm trying to get across is I try to get as much refreshers and make sure that I'm articulate and reasonably well read in all kinds of the literature over all the stuff that we've been covering. And so I know that's a lot to do, and maybe it takes up valuable time that I could be diverting to something else, but it's something that I like to do. So those are the definitions of witch. This is an excerpt from Houghton's book, The Witch, that I think is interesting and then kind of gets at his argument. His argument in the book talks about how the witch can be situated in ancient history, and he talks about, in particular, the fear of the witch can be explained drawing on ancient history and other basically other sources throughout the world, and helps explain the fear in Europe of witchcraft in the 1300s all the way to the late 1600s. I told you guys about The Crucible. That's one of my favorite pieces of theater. So if you need an extra copy of that, I have 2 copies of it. I'll be more than willing to lend them out. The Crucible is about the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts in 1692. It is an analogy about the persecution that Arthur Miller felt the American government was organizing against suspected communists in the 1950s. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the year. So, some background. Um, Several centuries ago, many practicing Christians and those of other religions had a strong belief that the devil could give certain people known as witches the power to harm others in return for their loyalty. A witchcraft craze rippled through Europe from the 1300s to the end of the 1600s, and tens of thousands of supposed witches, mostly women, were executed. So the Crucible, there's an excerpt from the Crucible that I think is really interesting and kind of, um, using Arthur Miller's interesting language and no doubt color or flowery language to convey the same idea. So he talks about our difficulty in believing the, for want of a better word, political inspiration of the devil is due in large, in great part to the fact that he is called up and by not called up and damned not only by our social antagonists but by our own side, whatever it may be. The Catholic Church, through its Inquisition, is famous for cultivating Lucifer as the archfiend, but the Church's enemies relied no less upon the old boy to keep the human mind enthralled. Luther was himself accused of alliances with hell, and he in turn accused his enemies. So he's talking about the prolific use of the devil by Christian fundamentalists as a tool to cast aspersions on their enemies, or to cast doubt on their enemies as well. Also, really important during this time period is the Gutenberg printing press. In the 1500s, the Gutenberg printing press expanded literacy. And we often think of literacy as a good thing. Here at IDEA, we talk about closing the literacy gap. Like I've told you guys a million times, if you're not reading a lot more, if you're not writing a lot more, then you really don't have a good opportunity of passing my AP World History exam. And you also don't have a lot of good prospects of doing really well in college. So you need to be doing that. But literacy in the 1500s, the widespread dissemination of information, there was actually a lot of really, really unreliable sources, so to speak, that were spread in the 1500s. So, for example, the second most popular book, I believe from the 1500s to the 1600s, was The Witch's Hammer, which was written by this man named Heinrich Kramer. And so it talks about the prevalence of witches in Europe, and give some signs of identifying witches. And spoiler alert, I hate to go Vernon Dursley on all of you, but there's no such thing as witches. So it was the second most popular selling book behind the Bible for about a century. So you can imagine the impact of this on European political systems and law. And so another important backstory, so during the 1500s, we see Martin Luther nail 95 theses to the door of a Catholic church. So during the reign, this kind of is a symbol of Catholics being fed up with the Catholic Church. So during the reign of Pope Leo X, discontent among Catholics in Europe was at an all-time high. And it all kind of centered on this, the sale of indulgences. So the sale of indulgences, the Catholic Church would essentially sell tickets into heaven. So if you bought an indulgence, you were guaranteed salvation. So it was a lot of people felt that was very corrupt. And so Martin Luther finally kickstarts the Protestant Reformation, and it's an apocryphal tale by most historians measure, meaning that it likely didn't happen. But Martin Luther did write 95 theses criticizing the Catholic Church, and inviting new possibilities of or inviting a schism with the Catholic Church, which is basically, I guess, a split, um, uh, or allowing for new religions to develop as well in Europe. And so that's him nailing the 95 Theses to the door. The Catholics were worried that they were losing a lot of people to a lot of these new Christian religions, so they orchestrated the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So through the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church sunk deeper into a pit of scandal and corruption. By the 1520s, Martin Luther's ideas crystallized opposition to the Church, and Christian Europe was torn apart. In response, the Catholic Church set in motion the Counter-Reformation. An era of strict conformity and accompanying terror had begun. And so go ahead and pause the video if you want to see this timeline. I recommend, if you're weak on the content, definitely pause the video. And so now we get into the summary and point of view practice, which is the main point of this video is about. So first of all, I give you a hypothetical prompt. So the prompt says, evaluate the extent of Christianity's effect on political structure and law during the 15th and 16th century. And so this would be a document-based question prompt. And so I give you one document. Of course, you'll have 7 documents. You need to source 3 of those documents at least. And sourcing involves a summary of the document and a point of view statement. And so I'm going to demonstrate how to do that on the next slide. But document 1 is written by Heinrich Kramer. He's a German Catholic clergyman and author of The Hammer of Witches, which I already discussed, a handbook which serves as exposition of witchcraft and a code of procedure for detection and punishment of witches in 1486. So go ahead and read that. So pause the video, read it, and then come and see my summary and point of view statement. So sourcing, like I said, sourcing a document involves a short summary and a point of view statement. Quoting the document is never really useful. Just summarize or paraphrase the document as much as possible. That's going to get you much more coherent paragraphs on the document-based question. So this is an example. I've color-coded it. So first thing you would want to do is you would actually want to do SOAP analysis. So SOAP. So you would do just kind of like SOAP, and then in short words you would write all the information that you knew. So when you talk about the speaker of a source, you get it directly from the document, so it's Heinrich Kramer, but you want to bring in outside information about Heinrich Kramer if possible. If not possible, you can talk about other elements of SOAP more heavily, and that will also probably get you the sourcing point. The reason why we focus on SOAP is because really, if you miss one, or if you're a little off on one, maybe the AP grader will cut you some slack. So in the summary actually of the document is, in the document, Kramer endorses the jailing and torturing of suspected witches. I think it would be more elaborate depending on your background information. Mine isn't very elaborate, but it gets to the point, right? And then when I actually talk about the speaker, Heinrich Kramer, I bring in outside information. So in purple, you can see that. Heinrich Kramer was a best-selling author who trafficked in a lot of misogynist tropes in his book, The Witch's Hammer, at a time of great ideological and religious chaos in Europe. And so the yellow is the occasion, right? So I combine S and O of my SOAP analysis together, and I merge them. And then, to be honest, you don't have to write a point of view statement in 2 sentences. If it doesn't work for you, don't worry so much. You can write it in 3 or 4 even. That would be okay, as long as you try to have as much elements of SOAP as possible. If you don't know outside information about the speaker, then just identifying his purpose or his audience would be sufficient as well, or his occasion. Situating the document in an historical context or situation would be okay. And so I also describe his audience was gullible religious people that believed that the devil played an active role in human affairs. So that's an assumption, but it's probably pretty accurate. Um, and then I put his declarations that witches were an active threat that the authorities should take on endorse the centrality of the Christian religion in the legal space and the need to use state resources to combat the devil. And so this whole point of view statement and summary, which together combines into a good sourcing of the document, would allow me to support an argument evaluating the extent of Christianity's effect on political structure and law during the 15th and 16th century.